The silver screen promised perfection, flawless faces, immaculate gowns, and stars who seemed to exist beyond ordinary human flaws. But behind the studio lights was another Hollywood, one filled with strange routines, neglected appearances, private obsessions, and secrets the cameras never showed. Some legends guarded those habits fiercely. Others simply stopped caring. And as we move through these stories, the distance between Hollywood glamour and reality becomes harder to ignore. Actor number 1: Cameron Diaz. Cameron Diaz built her career on an image of effortless beauty. Blonde, athletic, radiant, and seemingly untouched by the ordinary inconveniences of life, she became one of Hollywood's most recognizable stars. But according to the account in our source, her personal routine was remarkably different from the polished image appearing on magazine covers. The story begins with deodorant. Diaz has reportedly said that she does not wear it because she believes it can cause breast cancer. That claim has no scientific support, but it apparently became part of her reasoning for avoiding the product. And she did not simply replace deodorant with another conventional routine. Her approach to washing her face was even more unusual. The source says Diaz claimed she had never washed her face with soap during her adult life. Instead, she used a dry towel to remove makeup. Over time, the routine was described as leaving behind layers of old makeup, dead skin, and accumulated grime. Diaz regarded that buildup as something of a protective barrier against aging. Then came the showers. Rather than bathing every day, the account says Diaz showered approximately every 4 days. Between showers, dry shampoo became part of her routine. But dry shampoo does not magically remove everything from the scalp. In the story, repeated use created a thick buildup that Diaz picked away with her fingernails. And those hands had somewhere else to go. The source claims that after removing the residue from her scalp, she would rub it onto her pants. Those pants, particularly her jeans, were supposedly worn for months without washing. Like several other celebrities in this account, Diaz was said to freeze her jeans inside a bag in an attempt to deal with bacteria and odor. Freezing, however, was presented as merely preserving the smell rather than eliminating it. But the strangest detail involved her feet. According to the transcript, Diaz rarely wore socks. Her shoes gradually became darkened by accumulated sweat and dirt, producing an odor described in deliberately outrageous terms. The story paints a picture almost opposite to the woman audiences knew from the red carpet, the glamorous actress surrounded by cameras, while her everyday habits were portrayed as stubbornly unconventional. What makes the story particularly memorable is that none of this was presented as an accident. Diaz's attitude, according to the account, was one of complete indifference toward conventional cleanliness. She was wealthy enough to afford anything she wanted, famous enough to have people around her constantly, and surrounded by stylists and beauty professionals, yet she supposedly chose routines that rejected many ordinary hygiene practices. That contradiction is what makes her story such a striking opening to this journey. Hollywood sold an image of perfection, but behind the image was a woman who apparently cared far less about traditional beauty rituals than the public imagined. And if Cameron Diaz represented modern Hollywood's refusal to follow the usual rules, the next story takes us back to an era when glamour itself became almost mythological, and when one of America's most photographed women carried a very different secret behind that famous smile. Actor number 2: Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe remains one of the most enduring images of 20th century Hollywood. The platinum hair, the white dress, the breathy voice, the carefully photographed face, everything about her public image was built around sensual perfection. Yet the source presents a much less polished private picture. According to the account, Monroe rarely took conventional baths or showers. Instead, she relied on sponge baths at her sink, sometimes using the same sponge for months. The longer that sponge remained in service, the more unpleasant the story became, with the source claiming that it eventually developed mold. Her approach to deodorant was similarly unconventional. Monroe reportedly avoided it because she believed it clogged her pores. The result, according to the account, was that she simply allowed her natural body odor to remain. One of the more romantic stories attached to Monroe came from Arthur Miller, who reportedly described her scent in far more flattering terms. The source dismisses that description as poetic rather than literal and replaces the romance with a much harsher portrayal. Whether every detail of the story can be established historically is another question, but the contrast itself is revealing. The public saw an almost impossibly feminine fantasy, while these stories imagined an ordinary human being with ordinary physical problems. Her hair was another part of the routine. Monroe supposedly arrived at the studio without washing it beforehand, leaving the hair department to work around greasy roots. Dry shampoo was used to disguise the oil, but according to the source, that simply layered powder over the existing buildup. The account then turns to her hands and fingernails. Monroe was said to scratch her scalp with fingernails that were not always clean. Behind the immaculate white manicure, the story imagines a less glamorous reality. But the most uncomfortable detail concerned her bathroom habits. The source claims Monroe sometimes refused to flush after using the toilet because she considered the sound unladylike. Guests supposedly encountered the consequences, and Joe DiMaggio reportedly learned to check the toilet before using it himself. Her bedroom allegedly followed the same pattern. Monroe supposedly slept on the same sheets for months, allowing sweat, makeup, and bodily oils to accumulate. She reportedly referred to the bed as her nest, a private refuge that contrasted sharply with the perfectly controlled world photographed by Hollywood studios. Then came the ending. Marilyn Monroe died on August 4, 1962. The source describes her final surroundings in deliberately grim terms, emphasizing the unwashed bed and nightgown in which she was found. That contrast is what makes the story linger. Marilyn Monroe spent her career becoming one of the most carefully manufactured symbols of beauty in history. Yet behind the image was a woman whose private life could be chaotic, lonely, and deeply removed from the fantasy projected onto the screen. The tragedy is that the public wanted Marilyn to remain an image forever. But the next story belongs to another Hollywood icon whose private struggles were even harder to separate from her public life. Her voice could make millions dream, and her personal decline would eventually become impossible to hide. Actor number 3, Judy Garland. Judy Garland gave Hollywood one of its most unforgettable voices. As Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, she sang "Over the Rainbow," and became permanently associated with innocence, hope, and wonder. Yet the life behind that voice was far darker than the world she represented on screen. According to the source, Garland's personal hygiene deteriorated dramatically during periods when her drug addiction made ordinary self-care difficult. She could reportedly go weeks without showering. The demands of performing did not make things easier. She continued working while carrying the physical consequences of exhaustion, substance use, and neglect. Co-stars and crew members were said to notice the problem. The account claims that Garland sometimes responded to complaints with a joke about being an artist and artists having their own smell. Beneath the humor was a much more serious reality. Her personal life was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Her dental habits were described as equally severe. Garland supposedly rarely brushed her teeth, leaving them stained by cigarettes and coffee. Cavities reportedly went untreated because she did not regularly see a dentist. Instead, the story claims she sometimes used whiskey as a makeshift mouthwash. Her costumes were not spared either. The source says Garland could wear the same stage dress throughout an extended tour. Eventually, sweat became permanently embedded into the fabric, including a persistent stain beneath the arms that she supposedly regarded almost affectionately as a lucky mark. Her feet also suffered from neglect. The account says she sometimes wore the same stockings for an entire week. The dressing room allegedly became so unpleasant that stagehands struggled to remain inside, with one worker reportedly quitting because of the odor. Then came an unusual bathroom habit. Garland supposedly avoided flushing after bowel movements because she felt embarrassed by the sound. According to the story, she sometimes left the toilet for someone else to deal with. It would be easy to turn such details into ridicule, but Garland's story carries a darker dimension. Unlike celebrities whose strange routines were portrayed as eccentric choices, her neglect was intertwined with addiction, relentless work, emotional suffering, and the pressures of being a performer from childhood. By the final years of her life, the situation had become much worse. Garland died on June 22, 1969. The source describes her final clothing and physical condition in stark terms, presenting an image dramatically different from the glowing Dorothy audiences remembered. That contrast is perhaps the most painful part of Judy Garland's story. The woman who gave generations a song about finding a beautiful world beyond the rainbow spent much of her own life struggling to escape the darkness surrounding her. And Garland was not the only actress whose private suffering became entangled with neglect. Another pioneering star faced a different kind of battle, one involving exhaustion, poverty, and the brutal realities of being a black performer in classic Hollywood. Actor number 4, Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge possessed the kind of beauty Hollywood knew how to photograph but did not always know how to protect. She became the first black actress nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress, breaking a barrier in an industry that routinely denied opportunities to black performers. Behind that achievement, however, the source describes a woman whose personal life eventually became overwhelmed by exhaustion and financial hardship. Dandridge spent long hours performing, singing, and dancing. After exhausting stage appearances, she reportedly had little energy left for ordinary routines. Instead of showering, she sometimes went directly to bed still wearing sweat and stage makeup. The result supposedly accumulated night after night. Her sheets were said to remain unchanged for weeks, allowing sweat and makeup to build up. The source compares the smell to an old locker room, but the more important point is what the routine represented: a performer whose working life demanded enormous physical effort, while her private resources steadily disappeared. Her makeup brushes became another problem. Dandridge allegedly used the same brushes for years without washing them. According to the account, recurring skin infections developed on her face, although she attributed those problems to professional stress rather than contamination from her makeup tools. Her bathroom habits were also described as unusual. The source claims she sometimes did not flush after urinating because she wanted to conserve water and money. Guests supposedly found the practice disturbing. As her financial troubles worsened, basic supplies became harder to afford. The story says Dandridge eventually used dish detergent instead of soap to wash her body. The harsh detergent reportedly dried her skin, producing painful cracks and rashes on her arms and legs. At that point, hygiene was no longer simply a question of preference. It had become part of a much larger crisis involving exhaustion, poverty, depression, and declining circumstances. Dandridge died at the age of 42 from an overdose of barbiturates. According to the source, her apartment contained empty bottles and dirty clothing, and the coroner recorded the condition of her unwashed body. That ending makes her story profoundly different from the mocking anecdotes surrounding some other names on this list. Dorothy Dandridge was a trailblazer who had already endured extraordinary barriers simply to become visible on screen. Her later struggles were not the story of a glamorous star casually rejecting soap. They were part of a much more tragic collapse. And if Dandridge's story shows how hardship could overwhelm a star, the next actress presents another contradiction entirely: a woman celebrated as one of the most beautiful people ever photographed, while possessing a reputation for habits that seemed almost absurdly incompatible with that beauty. Actor number 5, Hedy Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr was often described as one of the most beautiful women in the world. Yet beauty was only one part of her story. She was also an inventor, a woman whose intelligence extended far beyond the glamorous roles Hollywood offered her. According to the source, however, Lamarr's personal hygiene was remarkably different from her polished public image. The account claims she took a bath only once a month. The reasoning attributed to her was equally unusual. Frequent washing supposedly interfered with her natural magnetism and sexual appeal. Instead of relying on regular bathing, she reportedly used expensive French perfumes to conceal accumulated sweat and body odor. That combination, according to the story, became noticeable even among wealthy neighbors in Beverly Hills, who allegedly complained about smells drifting from her home. Her hair was supposedly treated in much the same way. Lamarr could go approximately 6 weeks without shampooing. Styling products helped maintain the appearance audiences expected, but the source describes those products as effectively trapping oil and dirt beneath the surface. the contrast is almost cinematic. On screen, dark hair perfectly arranged, luminous skin, immaculate costumes. Behind the scenes, layers of styling products, oil, and build-up hidden beneath the carefully maintained image. Her dental routine was even stranger. Rather than flossing, Lamar reportedly used a sewing pin to remove food from between her teeth. It was allegedly the same pin she used for sewing buttons and was not sterilized before being used in her mouth. The source claims her gums bled regularly as a result. Then came the later years. As Lamar experienced severe mental decline, her hygiene supposedly deteriorated further. The story says she eventually stopped bathing altogether and could wear the same dress for months. Some store owners allegedly refused her entry because of the odor. Her son was quoted as saying she had not bathed during the final 2 years of her life. Lamar died in 2000 at the age of 85. Her legacy, however, extends far beyond these stories. She remains remembered for her beauty, her acting career, and her work as an inventor. That makes the hygiene narrative especially striking because it clashes so dramatically with the image of control and sophistication attached to her. But old Hollywood was full of such contradictions. For the next story, the contradiction becomes almost symbolic. This actress built an entire public identity around mystery, distance, and solitude. Even her refusal to appear ordinary became part of the legend. And according to the source, that included refusing to appear clean. Actor number 6 Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo turned privacy into an art form. Her famous desire to be left alone became one of the defining elements of her legend. She seemed almost less like a person than an apparition, an elegant Swedish star who could disappear from public life and make the disappearance itself fascinating. The source claims Garbo's relationship with bathing was equally unconventional. She reportedly took a bath no more than once every couple of weeks. Even more unusually, the account says members of her family sometimes used the same bathwater sequentially, with Garbo entering only after her mother and sister. By the time she supposedly entered the tub, the water was described as gray and cloudy. Garbo, according to the story, did not consider this particularly important. Deodorant was another thing she allegedly rejected completely. She supposedly regarded natural body odor as honest and beautiful, a belief that apparently put her at odds with co-stars. John Barrymore is credited in the source with a colorful insult comparing her scent to that of a Viking who had gone years without encountering a fjord. Whether the line is authentic or simply part of Hollywood folklore, it captures the kind of mythology that grew around Garbo. Her silk scarves were supposedly part of the same private ritual. Garbo allegedly wore certain scarves for years without washing them, eventually allowing sweat from her neck to accumulate until the fabric became stiff. She called one of them a lucky scarf. Dental care was also portrayed as minimal. The source says Garbo did not brush her teeth at night and instead wiped them in the morning with a dry cloth. No toothpaste. No water. Just fabric. Her breath, according to the account, became legendary among people who worked around her. What makes Garbo's story different is the way the behavior supposedly fit her personality. Cleanliness, the source claims, seemed to her vulgar and overly American. She regarded herself as European and above such ordinary concerns. She died in 1990 at the age of 84. Her New York apartment reportedly contained no soap in its bathrooms because she had deliberately removed it. That detail almost feels like the perfect ending to Garbo's mythology. She had spent decades controlling access to herself, avoiding publicity, and constructing an image of absolute independence. Even soap, according to this story, had been banished from her private kingdom. But if Garbo's isolation was quiet and deliberate, the next star's relationship with personal cleanliness was far more theatrical. She dressed in men's suits, smoked with dramatic elegance, and became one of the most recognizable women in European and American cinema. Her glamour, however, allegedly stopped at the surface. Actor number 7 Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich knew exactly how to create an image. Tailored suits, smoky makeup, dramatic lighting, and an unmistakable presence transformed her into one of cinema's most sophisticated stars. The source, however, paints a radically different picture of her personal routines. According to the account, Dietrich almost never washed her legs. She reportedly believed soap was unnecessary on them and limited her cleaning to areas she considered essential, using a damp cloth instead. The result was described as a visible accumulation of dead skin and dirt. Her feet supposedly received even less attention. She allegedly wore the same silk stockings for an entire week without changing them. The source claims the resulting odor was strong enough to clear a theater. Then there was her purse. Dietrich reportedly refused to throw away used tissues, keeping them in her designer handbag for months. The purse allegedly developed a mixture of old perfume and stale tissues that friends found deeply unpleasant. Her coffee cup was even more extreme. According to the story, she used the same personal cup for 10 years without washing it. Dietrich supposedly believed the accumulated coffee stains improved the flavor. Her later years became more difficult. Heavy alcohol consumption was part of the account, and after a fall, Dietrich reportedly became bedridden for 12 years. During that period, bathing became rare. Nurses allegedly struggled to change her sheets because Dietrich resisted them, even shouting at them in German. The source claims that after her death in 1992 at the age of 90, an embalmer had to spend approximately 3 hours cleaning her body before beginning the usual preparations. It is a grim image, but it also reflects the central contradiction in Dietrich's legend. She represented refinement. She represented sophistication. She represented the kind of glamour that made every movement look deliberate. Yet the story suggests that beneath the tuxedos and carefully applied makeup was a woman increasingly detached from ordinary hygiene. Whether every anecdote belongs to documented history or Hollywood folklore, the story has survived because it contradicts everything Dietrich represented publicly. And that contradiction leads naturally to another pioneer whose elegance on screen concealed a completely different collection of private habits. She was the first Chinese-American movie star to achieve international fame, and her story reveals how stereotypes, personal beliefs, and Hollywood pressure could collide in unexpected ways. Actor number 8, Anna May Wong. Anna May Wong broke barriers long before Hollywood was prepared to recognize how significant her career would become. As the first Chinese-American movie star to achieve international fame, she brought an elegance and presence to the screen that made her unforgettable. Yet according to the source, Wong's personal routines were anything but conventional. Her hair was at the center of the story. Instead of regular shampoo, she reportedly used rice water approximately once a month. The account says the rice water sometimes remained in the bathroom for days before being used, becoming fermented in the heat. The result, according to the source, was an unpleasant odor despite Wong's hair appearing beautiful on camera. Deodorant was another subject. The source claims Wong believed Asian people did not need it because of supposed genetic differences. Her co-stars on Shanghai Express allegedly asked her to use some form of deodorant, but she reportedly refused. Her smoking habits added another layer. Wong supposedly did not wash her hands after smoking, leaving her fingers stained yellow with nicotine. She then handled food and sometimes touched other people's faces with those same fingers. The account becomes even more extreme when discussing lingerie. Wong allegedly wore the same undergarments for an entire week, turning them inside out and backward at different points in an attempt to extend their use. According to the story, directors eventually became reluctant to work with her because of the smell. That claim carries a particularly tragic dimension because Wong's career was already constrained by racial prejudice. She had to navigate an industry that routinely denied Asian actors major roles while simultaneously relying on stereotypes about Asian characters. The source says Wong died in 1961 at the age of 56, and that her autopsy noted severe skin infections attributed to poor hygiene. Whatever one makes of the individual anecdotes, her larger legacy remains that of a pioneer who achieved visibility under extraordinary limitations. The contrast between that pioneering career and the humiliating hygiene stories attached to her name illustrates something darker about Hollywood folklore. Stars who challenged the industry's expectations could later become the subjects of exaggerated private legends. And the next woman was no stranger to controversy. Known as the Mexican Spitfire, she possessed an explosive screen presence, and a personality that could dominate any room. But according to the source, the most unforgettable thing she left behind was not always her performance.